Hey lady, welcome to the Postpartum on Purpose podcast. If we haven't met, my name is Anne Marie and I'm wife to James and mom to 4 beautiful kids, ranging from 9 down to 1 with one on the way. My hope is to help other women experience postpartum as a time of grit, growth, and grace. This is episode 39. Hi lady, how are ya? So I'm just laughing because starting this podcast in the first place was a little bit ridiculous. I'm not a tech person. And every time that I record, not every time, but like some of the times, because I record in the evening when I'm tired, there are only 2 cords that have to be plugged in, but sometimes they're not plugged in properly. So this is the third time that I've said, this is episode 39. Hi lady, how are ya? Because this is how many times it took me to get the cords correctly plugged into the right places. Okay, let's talk. Today, I just want to talk about something so lighthearted. Last week was a heavier topic, a weightier topic, and an important one. And this week, I wanted to be light and breezy and also not require a tremendous amount of brain power. Because again, I'm filming this at night after my kids go to bed, at least after the little boys go to bed. So I wanted to talk about what I read during postpartum. And not necessarily what I read, but like, what do you read? What do you want to read? Part of the tagline for this, or the tagline for this podcast, is grit, growth, and grace. The idea being that postpartum is a time to demonstrate or show grit, to lean on God's grace, and also to grow. Grow your mindset, grow your skill set, grow your knowledge. And I think one of the ways we can do that is to be intentional about how we educate ourselves. And just the idea that we would educate ourselves during postpartum. Now you will find I'm going to talk about some of the books that I read before, and then a couple books that I just ordered on Amazon right before this episode for the upcoming postpartum period, because as I record this, I am 2 days away from 29 weeks. Yay! That being said, you will notice there is not a great degree of intellectual rigor. I don't mean that the materials are dumb. What's a better word for that? I just mean that there aren't a lot of heavy-duty classics. There isn't any War and Peace on here, for example. Having grown up homeschooled, I did read plenty of classics. I have read plenty of classics. And when I'm not in the imminent postpartum period, which I'll refer to as perhaps definitely the first 3 months, maybe through the first 6 months. When I'm not in the imminent postpartum period, I may have more time for something that is more intellectually stimulating and rigorous, but generally not in the first couple of months, especially with sleep deprivation. So, be that as it may, getting that disclaimer out of the way, you're not going to find anything too heavy duty here. Something, though, that does motivate me is a purposeful effort to back away from smartphone usage. And the reason that's important to me during postpartum is because, perhaps you are not like this at all, but because when I am sleep deprived and also excited and a little hormonal, tend to use my smartphone less wisely and not more wisely than when I am fully rested or closer to fully rested and not imminently postpartum. Which is just a fancy way of saying I tend to get hooked on social media more so when I'm tired and sleep deprived early postpartum than when I'm not. And because I know that about myself, and I think I can generalize that to a fair amount of women, perhaps not all, but maybe most, because I know that about myself, I purposefully think about what I want to read during the postpartum period instead of getting sucked into social media, which frankly, I don't ever find to be helpful for my mental health. All right, what do I read? The last couple postpartum periods I've chosen a theme and then interlibrary loaned multiple books around that theme. Now, I can't remember exactly which one was which, but I definitely did charcuterie board books for one postpartum, and something else too around this theme, or the idea of a theme is Generally, I like to get something that, one, I can pick up and put down and not be too upset about it. If I get interrupted, if it's a very short time that I have to read, maybe the baby's feeding for a little bit, that's okay. I can pick the book up, I can read it a little bit, peruse, browse, and put it back down. I am not studying for an exam. There's no test on what I'm reading. I'm simply absorbing maybe a little bit of information and then putting it back down. So coffee table books actually work really well, I've found, for the early postpartum period, and charcuterie board books are often that type of a book. So charcuterie board books, I did one postpartum. Another postpartum, I read is kind of a loose term. I browsed lots of flower arranging books, and I have come to love flower arranging, so much so that once a year, at least once a year, usually in the spring, I will have women over and I will do a flower arranging workshop, which is a little fancier than what actually happens. That is a little fancier way of saying I get a whole bunch of flower arranging books in the library and invite a whole bunch of women over and go and get all of the $5 and $10 and $15 bouquets from Walmart and Aldi, and usually order one specialty flower, which is always greenery, from a florist, an actual florist, and then we arrange. So we do a super short tutorial, and then we arrange flowers, and it's lovely. So one postpartum period, I had charcuterie board books that I read. Another one I did flower arranging. For the one that's up ahead, I think I'm going to do interlibrary loans, as many as I can get my hands on, of suggestions that are related to home management and home, not just cleaning, but suggestions that are in the Summa Domestica trilogy by Lila Marie Lawler. I've just been going through this trilogy off and on for maybe 9 months now, and she recommends various books here and there. So I'm thinking I'm going to go through, just skimming the pages, right? I'm going to go through and get as many books as I can off of that recommendation and just go through them. Again, I'm not holding myself to any standards of high journalistic integrity in terms of the book has to be very intellectually rigorous, but I do really like the idea of gleaning ideas. There's no pressure on myself to take in a certain amount of information or to pay very close attention, but simply this idea of gleaning. I'm going to sift through what I find, an idea here, an idea there. That's great. That's perfect. I don't know if all of those will be coffee table type books, but I'm going to find out. A couple of other books. What else? I wrote down some of the things that I've liked. I've always been drawn to personal development type books, and if they can be humorous at the same time, that's terrific. One such is Your Blue Flame by Jennifer Fulwiler. She is a mom of 6 and a stand-up comedian. Your Blue Flame is about finding a talent or skill that really makes you come alive. And of course, you can have more than one, but generally you have a primary one, at least for any given time in your life. So Your Blue Flame is excellent. Also excellent, also nonfiction, is her, would you call it a memoir? I suppose she wrote a memoir that is called Something Other Than God, which I haven't read. That was about her conversion from atheism ultimately to Catholicism. But One Beautiful Dream is more like the story of her family life and having her kids and the mental shift that came from, as you can imagine, very significant shift from atheism to Catholicism in terms of being open to life and also not being a terribly organized person who had a lot of kids. So that was really enjoyable. So One Beautiful Dream was good too. Not a personal development book, but very good. Another, I suppose it's a personal development book, but was The Lazy Genius. And I read that one the last time. It's by Kendra Adachi. In the first episodes of this podcast, I mentioned her often. If you haven't listened to the first maybe 6, 7 episodes, go back. They're totally worth it. They're not just my postpartum stories, but they also heavily mention Kendra Adachi, the Lazy Genius. My sister Claire introduced me to her and told me, she told me, I want to know what this book is about. Can you read it? Which is such a younger sister thing to say to a bigger sister. But she knew me and she knew that I totally would, and I totally did. So, Kendra Adachi, The Lazy Genius. I was watching right before this because I wanted to remind myself of what I liked. You know how you have a sense, an impression that you really liked something, but when somebody asks you, so what did you love about it? You just sort of stare at them because you don't remember quite. You remember the impression, but you don't remember the specifics. I got on YouTube and there was a short series that Kendra Adachi filmed for her second book, The Lazy Genius Kitchen, but it reminded me of the major concepts from the first book that really rocked my world. She talks all about naming what matters and then naming what matters most. That was something that really resonated with me, particularly in the early postpartum period, recognizing, especially with each additional child that is added to our family, recognizing that not everything can matter equally to me. So noting in any given area of my life that might be difficult, what matters, but then whittling it down to say what matters most was a great distinction for me and very helpful to wrap my mind around. Yes, lots of things may be important to me, but what matters most to me at a given time about a specific thing. And she has steps under that, and they are prioritize, essentialize, which is getting rid of what's in the way of what matters. The clearest example I can give to you, and she has so many in her book, but the clearest example is just the one that I observed in this YouTube video series related to the Lazy Genius Kitchen. And she goes into this woman's home and helps her get rid of, but really make sense of how she wants her kitchen to flow. And she talks about getting rid of kitchen utensils that not just that she doesn't need, but ones that are getting in the way of what she wants most. I recall now, now as I'm talking, I recall that after I read, I can't remember which book it was, which of the two, but after I read them, I actually took all of the utensils, kitchen utensils that I don't regularly use, out of the drawer, and I have them in a very fancy old Nike shoebox that is in my china cabinet in the dining room. So if I need them, if I need something occasionally, like a potato peeler, which I never need because I don't actually know how to peel potatoes, I always told myself if I'm left-handed or because I'm left-handed, I can't do that. It's a story. But the things that I actually do use, just not often, like an ice cream scoop, such as other things, those are in the way of using the things that they're in the way of using the things that I want to access every day. So that was the direct result of reading The Lazy Genius or The Lazy Genius Kitchen, maybe both. Talking about then prioritizing, essentializing, and then organizing. So first getting rid of what's in the way of what matters most, and then organizing, then personalizing, and then systematizing. If this is all to you, like, Anne-Marie, why are you going into so much detail? Maybe it's not the book for you, but it sure was a great book for me. Your Blue Flame, The Lazy Genius. She also has a book called The Plan that she just put out recently this year about time management, and it's intended to be a time management book for women. And I liked that one. Not quite as much as The Lazy Genius, but I did like it. So if Lazy Genius, or if time management is particularly important to you, I would say that one could be a great recommendation. A home design, interior design, home decor, but in a very practical way that actually feels like you and telling your story book. That would be a lot of hyphens in between all those words, wouldn't it? Is called Love the House You're In by Paige Ryan. She did an excellent job of having bite-sized chapters that asked questions at the end to really draw out what's important to you. Not what's important to somebody else, not to just pick up and buy everything from the Magnolia display at Target, but to get clear on what your personal story and your family's personal stories are, and then to tell that. Love the House You're In. Really recommend that one. Another book I read that's, I would say, pretty close to a coffee table book, though I couldn't quite get it to lay open on its own, is Worthy of Wearing by Nicole M. Caruso. This book surprised me because there was more theology in it, more philosophy and theology, I would say, than I expected. but there were still beautiful glossy cover pictures to look at. There were still great questions to help me determine my personal style, what characterized it, the themes were, and what's useful for the season of life that I'm in currently. And then in the back, she had several resources that I got from the library that were just, they were just a pleasure to look through. I won't say they were anything, I don't know, just they were a pleasure to look through. I really enjoyed them. I am realizing there are very few titles that I've shared so far that have been fiction, and there are a couple of reasons for that. One, I don't read a lot of fiction, but I don't read a lot of fiction because I haven't found a lot of fiction that is super enjoyable. And I know romance novels and Christian romance novels are kind of an easy go-to. And if you find an author you like, chances are she's got approximately 30, right? But I don't read a lot of romance novels because, even Christian romance novels, because I've found a couple of things when I have. The first one is that they are like crack for my brain. And once I start, I don't want to put them down. It is very difficult for me to put down a romance novel once I've picked it up. I sort of liken it to what I think maybe the effect that video games have on your brain, or something else that is just so absorbing of your attention and time. And who has that to give during the postpartum period? At least I would say I don't find it to be healthy to be that sucked into something when, one, I'm likely to be interrupted, which then makes me grouchy with whomever interrupted me, which is wildly appropriate if the interrupting person is, let's say, 7 days old. But so I found that it's just not something I'm able to pick up and put down, and doesn't seem to have great effects on my brain because it's like I can't stop. Of course I can, right? I'm a grown-up just like you're a grown-up. I can, but it's very difficult to do so. And the second reason is because I don't generally find that they are helpful for my marriage. Now, I don't mean that what do I mean? I don't mean that they make me dissatisfied exactly with my marriage, but generally speaking, there seems to be an element that is unrealistic in them, and that I don't think leads to a strengthening of the bond between my husband and I. Now, a romance novel, generally speaking, would be off limits, just a generic mainstream one, because of the type of sexual content, like overtly sexual content they tend to have. And I've heard it described as porn for men could be similar to the erotica literature. I'm thinking like 50 Shades of Grey is one example. Erotica literature for women. But even if you leave that aside, even if you just have your very sanitized, stripped down, does anybody read anymore? Is that how you say her name? Janet Oki? Or Francine Rivers, I think, is one too. But even if you read somebody who is reasonably stripped down as far as the romance content, I'm picturing like a percentage in my head, there still tends to be something, I think, that leaves a restlessness as opposed to a contentedness. That's just amusing. You can take that or leave that. But that is why I don't read much in the way of explicit, that's not the right word. Of course, I don't read explicit romance. Much in the way that is specifically categorized as romance, even if it's Christian romance. Now, that being said, a book that I just put into my Amazon cart before this was called Love in the Eternal City. It's a debut novel from an author. And I've read good things about that. I think I read them on the very reliable Instagram. Somebody recommended that, Love in the Eternal City. So I just ordered that. That'll be a read postpartum, probably. I also ordered Holy Ambition, Thriving as a Catholic Woman at Work and at Home. I'm curious about that one because I am planning to step away more so from some of my work once the baby comes, but I still would like to see what it says. I know one of the co-authors and really trust and admire her, Taryn DeLong, and excuse me, please. Yeah, I'm curious to see what she says. Just a couple of other books here on the list. Oh, that are fiction. This is such a classic, right? But Pride and Prejudice, such a classic. I could read that probably once every year or every other year, and it's still fresh. It's still fresh. Also, don't laugh at me, but did you know the Pioneer Woman doesn't just write cookbooks? She has also written at least 2 other books that are memoir seems a little fancy term, but one of them I just re-borrowed from my sister because I saw it on her shelf. Frontier Follies, Adventures in Marriage and Motherhood in the Middle of Nowhere. It's just light. It's breezy. I think it's fun. And she also has, what is it called? Black Heels and Tractor Wheels. I believe that's the title. That's the story of how she met her husband, Lad. And that, as I recall, it's been several years now, but as I recall, that was a really enjoyable read too. So if you haven't checked out the Pioneer Woman's other books, I recommend you do that. And then the last fiction book that I wanted to recommend is called The Awakening of Miss Prim. And I'm not actually going to try to summarize it for you other than to say it's excellent, but I almost don't recommend it just because when I got to the end, I was so ready for the sequel, and there is no sequel. It was written almost 10 years ago. There is no sequel. So you get to the end, you're totally invested in the characters. You can't wait to see what happens next. And there is no follow-up. So I do recommend the book, but I'm also just giving you a heads up right now that do read it. Then, yeah, there's not a follow-up yet. And I looked tonight before I recorded this just to make sure I wasn't missing anything, but there's not. A book called, what's the other book I wanted to talk about? Oh, I am no major authority on devotionals that are excellent and readable in bite-sized chunks, but one that is really good, I do know, is called Jesus, I Trust in You. It's based on the Litany of Trust, which was composed by one of the Sisters of Life, Sister Faustina. That is really, really well done and was very insightful, and particularly during the postpartum period when for a whole variety of reasons we can find it difficult to trust. I do recommend the book Jesus, I Trust in You if you're wanting a devotional that you could read at night. It's a 30-day retreat in a book. It's easy and yet deep at the same time. And the last book I wanted to mention, I'm not sure exactly what category this fits into, but it's called A Mother's Rule of Life. I suppose it's a home management book in a way, but it talked about, and it's been a while since I've read that one too, so I think at some point I'll go back around to it, but it talked about this idea of having rhythms and routines in your day, and how, of course, you're not a cloistered nun, so you can't follow the exact times of prayer continually throughout the day the way they would, but you can think about what's important to you, and you can structure your day in such a way that you are continually returning to the rhythms of the church in terms of prayer, in terms of priorities, and work. A Mother's Rule of Life. I recommend that to you as well. I think that's pretty much everything, lady. Just books for you to consider if you're looking for something to read during postpartum. I'll talk to you next time. Bye.